Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, it's going to be a follow-up to my Change Over Time episode. This is a theory I've been developing over several years. Not one that doesn't build on already existing theories, but hopefully is a simple way of thinking about change through the therapeutic process that ideally is not unique necessarily to my relational psychodynamic model, but could arguably be mapped onto almost any model. Why is this important? Well, one is trying to tend to process work in a way that sort of honors a sense of direction or a rhyme or reason for the time spent on process work, right? What does any of that mean? Did that make any sense? Maybe not. But to me, we live in a world right now where there's a rub between short-term, quote-unquote, more economical and thereby more financially friendly intervention versus those that are longer term. And this is a really fruitful and important dilemma beyond the bullshit, excuse my French, around managed care that just tries to shove short term down everybody's throat if they had it their way. But it's a reasonable dilemma because a lot of people might only need shorter term care and treatment, but there's a lot of people who need longer term care treatment, and we should be doing that responsibly, right? And so how do we tend to process work? How do we make sure that there is still an arc, an overarching journey or narrative in the work that we're doing? And the ground, observe, act, I think methodology helps with this because it says, like, what is the purpose of the process that's unfolding? So first, a reminder, the ground, observe, act, it's an oversimplification, but the idea on the front end is grounding is just, think of it as a more mindful approach to existence, the ability to tap into one's world and understand what is motivating them and or, be able to sit with one's emotions sufficiently. Some people that requires grounding in the sense of like distress tolerance because emotions or triggers or whatever it might be is just kind of too much to handle. But for others, it's just to connect at all because a lot of us have dissociative and repressive types of defenses against past and or present content. And so that grounding phase is really essential, not required for everyone, but really essential to do any other work. Because if someone's not really attuned with themselves, you're not going to get very far when it comes to depth-based and process work. You can maybe get them coping in the here and now, but you're not going to get much deeper. Number two is the observational phase, and the whole purpose of this is to observe and look for greater themes and processes or enactments, whatever you want to call them, schemas, that get in the way of progress. And the reason why this phase is so important is because to get to meaningful intentional action, you need to create an ability to observe oneself a little bit more fruitfully to be able to even recognize the problem at hand. Sometimes people will just jump into change, they'll jump into action, but little do they realize they're recreating their problem in a different way, or sadly, sometimes in an identical, repeated way. And one of the best antidotes to that is an observation of self. And then finally, the action phase is the testing phase. It gets people back out there and gets them engaging in the world in a way where they get to practice their grounding and their observational skills to feed back into intentional action, because heaven knows we're not going to get it, giant air quotes here, right the first time, but allows us to more fruitfully tinker because we're sufficiently grounded, in touch with ourselves and our experiences, and we are more efficiently, more curiously, more open-mindedly, more diversely, more dialectically able to observe what's happening to us, which gives us a huge, lovely package of information and experience that feeds us right back into going back out there a second, third, 100th time. So when we're talking about process work, and being diligent and making sure that we're actually doing the real thing, right? We're not just sitting there kind of chilling with people talking about the news this week for the next 7 years without any real meaningful or intentional process. This is kind of the idea. The grounding phase, it's less kind of depth process work and more, it's more about just kind of mindful attention to the self. And a lot of this is pushing people to just monitor their moods, monitor their thoughts. I mean, this is even CBT can do a reasonable job at this, just to feel out where am I at, what am I feeling? Or at a more critical level, what will sometimes predate that is just something's too overwhelming to even encounter at all, in which case the ground term, which I think most people are more familiar with, is like straight up grounding techniques, straight up distress tolerance techniques, just an ability to tolerate being in a situation, an exposure, encountering an idea, whatever it might be. Now, you don't abandon this phase in process work. You're always keeping your eye on it because it's so foundational. And as people approach difficult things in their life, their ability to ground is going to be compromised somewhat. And that's totally normal, right? We call it, quote unquote, facilitative anxiety. You're not going to avoid this completely, but you don't want it to get to a debilitative level where defenses are employed as a means of guarding against the stress, but that guarding against usually steals away from an ability to be intentionally present in the moment. And it just obliterates the ability to observe. So while there might be a lot of initial work, if someone has, reporting upon their history with mental health issues and relationship issues, a lot of like, oh, they're not really connected, or they can't even speak to their narrative, you might spend a lot of initial time on grounding. But conversely, as you encounter new things in their life, or as they encounter new things and report them to you, you might go, oh, are you okay with where you're at? Or do you need some skill sets, or do we need to kind of revisit this whole grounding phase? And that will cause pauses in treatment, right? If it's on the second half, right? It's either an initial delay, which is not delay because it's laying the groundwork, or it'll cause sort of a pause to the observational and or action phase to make sure that grounding is sufficiently intact. Now, some people will get lost in this because grounding is kind of a nice safe zone. They don't have to observe and they don't have to take action. And so you have to be careful that this is a meaningful, intentional pause to shore up grounding versus it becoming an avoidance by perpetually sitting in a grounding phase. Because again, it's safe, it's easy. Quote unquote, I shouldn't say easy. It's easier than the other things. So that will periodically mark, at least in my work, will sometimes come back to grounding. The nice thing is, in my experience, once grounding is relatively secured, people develop like a reasonable repertoire that just gets them through the moments. They build upon that. I think people are if they're driven and motivated for the next steps, the grounding thing, all they need is a little bit of basic support, a little bit of basic education, and they're usually off to the races because their distress tolerance naturally goes up the more they're exposed to ideas and particularly the situations themselves. So there is that. The observational phase is probably the easiest one, I think, to get lost in because there's almost always something to be curious about. I love curiosity. And sometimes you have to do multiple passes through people's narratives and past, as well as multiple passes through here and now experiences to really observe and notice the trends and the themes that tend to be evoked in their circumstances. Like, what is the kind of gravitational pull for better and worse? I do emphasize better because there are absolutely strengths in people's native functioning independent of us providers. And it's good to recognize those strengths, particularly if people don't recognize them in themselves. Now, getting them to believe that, self-worth work, whole other level. But again, that's for better, but also for worse. The defenses, the things that kind of get in their way, the thing that they're gravitationally pulled toward that actually sabotages them or causes them to avoid or whatever it might be. And this takes time. You cannot do this quickly. I'm sorry. Anybody who says 12 sessions, 16 sessions, if someone has a repeated problem in their life that tends to replicate itself and they've not mastered it on their own in a decade, or heaven forbid, they've seen several providers, but they keep coming back for the same issue, we need to get away from this ideology that you're going to solve this in 6 sessions. I mean, there are certain depth-based models that really just cut right through the skin and go straight for the vital organs. And these are, I think, very talented providers who have a great ability to sort of sift through the noise and go intuitively and help the client intuit what is most problematic and cut to that and be like, boom, what are you going to do with that? But I would bargain for a lot of folks, it's more of a gradual process. And so shoving people into constant action and these shorter term interventions is doing more harm than good. I shouldn't say more harm than good. At best, it's doing nothing, right? It's helping them with short term coping, but they're going to be back in, cue it. It could be 6 months, it could be 5 years, whatever it is. The shelf life just is not going to last. So I give myself allowances to be in observational phases for a couple years. Now, this is not saying that there's zero action whatsoever. The only time there's very minimal action is when we're talking about like complex, super layered traumas, because there is a lot of like self grounding and self-observation, narrative identity building that often is required for action to feel sufficiently safe. That doesn't mean like they're totally engaging in no action, but I'm talking like big moves in their life, that ways to reclaim lost ground to trauma, or reclaim aspects that themes that trauma kind of stole away from them. It will take more time. Now, if I'm sitting there for several years and we're really not getting into fruitful action, that's usually a sign of like, okay, it's a similar issue with the grounding phase, where maybe we're just like over analyzing, or, I have my shorts episode on like analysis paralysis, a phrase I borrowed from a client who gracefully also says they borrowed it from somebody else, but such is the world, where it's like, okay, we can observe something forever because life goes on. There's always 10 different angles, and as we learn new things, maybe we need to reassess an understanding, right? You can look at the same piece of art 3 times and feel something different. You can read the same book 3 times, you can get something slightly different each time. But at some juncture, we need to make the leap and move into an action phase, because the guarantee is the action phase is going to recycle us through these phases. And so if we're not engaging in any action for several years, especially if we're not talking about like complex or layered traumas and adversities, something is quite wrong, in my opinion. We're not making good progress, because we need that experiential learning to really substantially change. At the end of the day, us human beings cannot change internally. We have to change through actual experience. Even the relational psychodynamic approach says and speaks to this. Like, we can't just heal relationally through the past. We heal through the present with our therapeutic relationship, but importantly with relationships outside of the therapeutic relationship. So we need to get into action sooner than later. And this is where like severity understandings or organizational levels we talk about in psychodynamic theory are really helpful. Because the more well-organized people are, the quicker you should be getting to action. Those who are less organized, it's okay to be a little bit more gradual in action. Now, the duration of the process work following action is probably the hardest part. Because for some people, all they need is that final push, and they'll go out and they'll engage in action, and they will very quickly run through either one, grounding was solid, doesn't need any augmenting or supplementing. If they do, even then, a lot of it's about observation and making sure that they're breaking old habits. Really well organized folks will that initial observational phase on the heels of grounding is sufficient that they catch it really quick on their own, and they can reflect this to you as a provider and go, I noticed something. And when they are making those links very rapidly, once they start doing something new, you're in probably for shorter term treatment overall. Now, do note, I say shorter term, that could still be 2 years, right? But you're going to make really good progress, because then it's about sustained action and just kind of like momentum building, which insurance companies might fruitfully argue that they don't need long-term care. They can probably self-guide and come back if they need boosters. This is where I, as a provider, if you're going to do longer-term care and not do those episodes of care, you should be fruitfully talking about the frame and necessity and say like, hey, you seem to be doing really well. Would you want to span things out so you have more time to test and come back to me and share your observations? Now, this is ignoring that there's a healing process in the relationship itself, but that's a whole other episode, and you have to be intentional about using the relationship to do so, and not just be kind of passively listening and be like, yeah, you're doing great. As organizational level goes down, or as the complexity of the problem goes up, the recycling through and the observational process just takes longer. Defenses do not die quickly. They just do not. And in many ways, especially from a psychodynamic lens, you're being the person's third eye very frequently to remind them and recycle through and notice things to build what we call as like an observing ego. If people do not have an ability to fruitfully observe themselves, up until seeing you, or it's more a newer thing in our life, additional support is invaluable to kind of mitigate the likelihood of regressions when they're out there on their own, especially if they don't have a support system that encourages them and sort of not like is their therapist, but kind of like helps keep that momentum going. And this extends the time in treatment. But again, there needs to be this like careful consideration of what is truly necessary and how fruitful. Like, where are we at in a change process? Where are we at? Like, what's the threshold for healthy enough to where they could do this independently? And that is a line in the sand I cannot draw. But it is the way to responsibly do process work, at least in my opinion, at least using my model, is that I'm checking each step of the way. And when we're really in an action phase, go, okay, is this something that they're really just using me at some point as a safety cue and they don't need me anymore? Versus what ways am I like a helpful, stable base to which they return, and it's just about boom, they're right back out there with momentum? Or am I really operating as what we call as an auxiliary ego, not out of dependence, not out of reluctance to take responsibility, not out of avoidance, not out of experiential avoidance, right? But legitimately, they're still internalizing this process that I am sort of a holder of the ground, observe, act process, that they're there, they understand it, but it isn't really part of their day-to-day flow yet. Because our goal is to make it perfect, but because they just need to internalize the process enough to not so frequently and or for such long durations regress into old ways of being. The best way to do this, frankly, to me, is collaborative conversations with clients, that you're bringing them along in your conceptualization and offering things freely so that they can kind of spot check, think about, and metacognate. They're like, okay, that's interesting. I hear what you're saying. What do I think and feel about that? And eventually there's a collaboration of like, I think we're good enough, right? Like, you can always come back, but I think it's good enough. I think you need to be on your own here for a little bit. And that to me is a quick and dirty version of like, what is responsible process work? How are we not falling prey into just doing therapy just for therapy's sake and losing the arc or the sort of like the journey, the narrative of therapy itself. So I don't know if that's super helpful. I again hope to create more episodes on this, but as always, I appreciate you for thinking, for watching and listening, and I guess observing, and stay curious.